My son kicked out his girlfriend, who's pregnant, and left his twin daughters with me. I'm 55 years old, and I have 2 children, George who's 31 and Gabrielle who's 29. My daughter Gabrielle got married a few months ago. She's been planning her wedding for what felt like forever. It was a huge wedding with a big party. I was helping her get everything ready, which seemed to involve looking at endless pictures of flowers. All of my family was really excited about the wedding, except my son, George. You see, George and his wife, Susanna, got a divorce a few years ago. They have twin girls, Amy and Alice. They're only 6 years old. They were trying to be good parents to them, but I felt heartbroken for the twins. It was hard to imagine how different everything must have felt for those little girls after their parents got divorced. It was sad, and I really wanted to help them, but I knew that it was important to stay out of the way and let George and Susanna handle it the way they thought was best. One evening, George brought his girlfriend over to my house for dinner. Her name was Bethany, and she was 25. They'd been together for a few months. They'd met at work, and it seemed like they were both really happy about the whole thing. While Gabrielle and I were talking about flowers for her wedding, Bethany asked George if he'd ever get married again. George seemed embarrassed. He looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about not knowing. Bethany looked really sad, and I knew that she'd wanted him to say yes. Right after that, Alice started to cry. She wished that her mommy and daddy would get back together. George and Bethany didn't even notice. Alice kept crying. I hugged her to try and make her feel better, and then I pulled George aside. I asked him if he was really sure about Bethany, but he got angry. He told me to mind my own business, and I told him that it was my business. Bethany was going to be around my granddaughters a lot, and I had to be careful about who I let into my house. Then George got even more angry. He said that it was all Gabrielle's fault for bringing up weddings. I told him to grow up and be happy for his sister, but Bethany started to yell. She told me that she and George were in love and that she didn't care what I thought about her. I was so upset with both of them. They started fighting. I was done with both of them. I told them to leave my house, and they walked out. They were angry. They even flipped me the bird. They left Amy and Alice at my house. I had to call Susanna and ask her to pick them up. I had a cake tasting with Gabrielle the next day, and I had to get ready. I was really angry. It felt terrible. I just didn't understand how I was supposed to tell my 31-year-old son how to act like a grown-up. It was crazy that I was in charge of telling a random woman to leave my house. I was frustrated and confused. What else could I have done? After I wrote about all of this online, people gave me some great advice. A few people said they thought it was good that I was trying to help George, but some people said that I was being too nosy. I decided to post another update to let everyone know what was going on. The next day, Bethany showed up at my house to apologize for how she had acted the day before. She said that she had something really important to tell me. She was pregnant. She had just found out that she was pregnant, and she told me that George had broken up with her. He said he was scared of being a father and that he couldn't handle the responsibility. He was afraid of being a dad. It made me sad to hear about it, but I spent hours talking to Bethany about everything. She said that she was going to have the baby even if George didn't want to be part of it. I told her that I'd be there to help with the baby. I told her that I would be a grandma to her child. I still felt really upset with George, so I called him to find out what he was thinking. He was mad about Bethany coming to my house, and he said that her baby wasn't even his. He wanted to know if I had anything to do with Bethany going to my house, but I told him that I hadn't. I asked him if he'd gotten a paternity test yet to find out if he was the baby's father. He said that he didn't have the money. It seemed like he didn't want to pay for the test because he didn't want to take responsibility. He had a lot of problems with taking responsibility. He had 3 kids, and he was still acting like a teenager. Later that day, Susanna called. She told me that George wasn't at her house, and he hadn't come to pick up Amy and Alice, like he was supposed to. I was really angry that he was still treating his children this way, but Susanna had also told me she had to get to work, so she was on her way over to my house with Amy and Alice. She had called Child Protective Services, CPS. She said that she had been struggling to take care of her girls on her own, and she felt that George didn't care about the girls at all. It was tough, and I felt sad for her. It sounded like she was going to ask for full custody, and honestly, I didn't blame her. I was so worried, and I wanted to know where George was. I called him 12 times, but he didn't answer. I tried calling his work, but they refused to give me any information. I couldn't believe that George had just left the twins at my house and didn't even say a word to me. I felt terrible. How could he treat his children this way? I was so angry and upset. I knew that I wouldn't do anything to help him. I didn't trust him anymore. Not unless he explained himself and took responsibility for everything he'd done. Time passed. A few months had gone by and I hadn't heard from George, but I was so worried. Finally, I decided to file a missing persons report to make sure that he was okay. I was so worried. I didn't want anything to happen to my son. The police said they would try to find him, and they asked for any information I had about where he might be. I told them that he worked in town, and I was going to try to get a hold of him again, but the police said they would find him. The next day, I called his work again. Finally, the receptionist told me that George had quit his job a few weeks earlier. I asked her if they had any information about where he'd gone, but she said she didn't know. Then, I got a call from George. He said he was okay, but he'd moved to a new state and he didn't want anything to do with Amy and Alice anymore. He said it was too much. He was tired of being a father. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He could not just decide to leave his daughters. He couldn't just walk away from his responsibility. He'd been a dad, and he had to stay a dad. He said that he'd never wanted kids in the first place and that his daughters don't look like him. Then he said goodbye and hung up the phone. It just seemed unreal to me. I couldn't believe that I had raised someone so selfish. How could he even think that way? It seemed like he'd changed and become someone I didn't even know. I called the police department back and told them that George was fine, so they could stop searching for him. I later found out that Susanna had gone to court and asked to become the only parent responsible for taking care of the girls. She didn't want George to see Amy and Alice, and he didn't even try to see them. He didn't seem to care. He wouldn't even send them birthday presents. It seemed like he wasn't planning to pay for their care, either, and I felt like he'd probably end up in jail, and that he deserved it. I'd been talking to Bethany regularly. She was 4 months pregnant. She said that George was the baby's father, but I still couldn't believe she wanted to have a baby with someone who couldn't even take care of his other children. He'd gone from not being there for his daughters to going off and starting a new family with someone else. They'd been fighting so much, and she was having a hard time. I wanted to help her, but I wasn't sure what to say or do. She hadn't told me why she was still with him. It seemed strange, but it was her business. She was going to get a paternity test, and he had found some money for it, though I still didn't understand how he was getting any money, and I figured he'd have to pay child support. I worried for her, and I hoped that everything would turn out well. Bethany had a hard time taking care of herself, so she moved in with me back in November so that I could help her. She had trouble cooking and cleaning, and she had to be careful because she was worried about her pregnancy. The doctor had said that if she got too stressed, it might cause problems with the pregnancy. I worried about Bethany and wanted to be there to help her. Over time, we'd actually become pretty good friends. I hadn't thought that would ever happen. It seemed like George wasn't going to be part of his daughters' lives, and I really hoped that he'd eventually change. I hoped he'd become a better person. I'd tried to keep away from him. He hadn't tried to contact me since he left. I couldn't understand how someone could just forget about their own children. I really missed the girls. It had been over 6 months since I wrote my last post online. I knew I should have given everyone an update a lot sooner. There had been so much going on. My daughter, Gabrielle, finally got married. I was so proud of her. The wedding was amazing. The ceremony was outside in the garden, and it was really beautiful. There was a big party after the wedding with dancing, and the food was wonderful. The only thing missing was George. He didn't come to the wedding. But everyone else was there, and we had a great time. I was happy to hear that Bethany had her baby. She had a healthy baby boy, which made me happy, and Bethany seemed to be a wonderful mother. It was great that she had a great place to live and that she had gotten a new job. She seemed really happy with her life, even though it was really hard for her at first. I was so proud of how strong she was. The family therapist was really helping Amy and Alice to deal with everything that happened with their dad. It had been a really tough time for the girls, but they seemed to be making progress. They were both starting to feel a little more confident. I felt good about that. They were becoming really strong young women. The family had to find a way to heal from all of the stress and sadness that had happened, and we'd been able to do that, but George hadn't made any progress. George got arrested for having illegal drugs. He had a bad habit that he just couldn't break, and now, he was going to pay the price. It made me sad. He called me from jail, and I thought he was going to ask me for money, but what he said was even worse. He wanted me to pay for a lawyer to help get him out of jail. I told him that he would have to fix the mess he made himself. He was a grown man and he needed to be responsible for his actions. I couldn't give him any more money. He needed to learn to be responsible for himself. He started to cry, saying that he was sorry for all the awful things he'd done, but he kept crying. Then he told me that another woman was pregnant with his child. At first, I couldn't believe him, but he told me about the woman and I found her page on Facebook. There was a picture of the two of them together. It seemed like he'd done this to another woman, too. He was making terrible choices. And I couldn't understand what was wrong with him. I hung up the phone. He called again a few days later. He said he was going to court soon. He seemed scared, and I understood. It wasn't fun going to court and getting in trouble with the law. But I felt like he had to face what he had done wrong, even though I knew it would be really hard on him. My husband and I decided to go to his trial. The trial was being held in another state. It was going to be a long trip. We had to be there to show George that he still had family. We had to try to figure out how to support him in this new mess he'd made for himself. We also wanted to find a way to find some peace. I told Susanna and Bethany what we were going to do, and they were shocked. They didn't think we should go. They felt like we were wasting our time. They both said that they would stay home and not go to the trial. The day of the trial came, and it felt surreal. I felt angry, I felt upset, and I felt heartbroken. I wanted to feel better about George. I wanted to be proud of my son, but he'd made bad choices, and the consequences had come back to haunt him. The judge found George guilty of all the charges against him. He'd been caught stealing from a store and destroying someone's property. He'd refused to pay for the girl's care. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, and the judge wouldn't even let him bargain for a lesser sentence. He had done really terrible things. The judge told George that he was going to pay for his bad choices. It seemed like a nightmare. Amy and Alice wouldn't see their dad for 6 years. I didn't understand what to do. I didn't know how to make this all go away, and I felt overwhelmed by all of this. I've been in touch with George every week, but I was still in shock about the trial, and I was feeling lost. He calls me almost every day. He keeps crying and begging for forgiveness. He wants to see Amy and Alice. He wants me to help him get out of jail, but I don't know how. He doesn't understand that I can't just make things better for him. Bethany and George haven't spoken since he was arrested. He can't see their child. He hasn't even called me to try and explain what happened to his other girlfriend. I don't even know if he still talks to her. It just felt terrible. This whole thing had been so painful and so overwhelming. It was good that I had been writing about this. I needed someone to listen to my story, and I needed someone to help me through this awful mess. I was still trying to figure out how to handle it. It's been so hard, but I hope that things will get better. Maybe our family will heal someday, but I just didn't know how to do it. I don't think I'm going to write another post online. I'm not sure I'll be able to write about it anymore. It's too hard. I just need time to deal with it all.